Okay, next chapter of Cortez and Montezuma, the retreat from the city. Chapter 11. There is no longer any choice, said Cortez, but to leave the city. The only question is, how shall we leave it, and when? Calling his officers together, a route was decided upon. It should be a certain less frequented avenue, which, though a little longer than some others, had the advantage of having a shorter causeway at its end. An astrologer in the army was consulted as to the time best for their departure. Go, he said, by night. The stars commend it. Cortez, either filled with the superstitions of his age or finding the astrologer's prophecy conveniently in accordance with his own desires, readily agreed to a midnight departure and began at once to make preparation. The rich booty taken in these many battles was divided among the officers, who were to guard it until they should again come into quarters. When this had been done, much booty still was left for want of means to carry it. Gold lay scattered in shining heaps upon the floor. Take what you will of it, said Cortez to his men. It is far better that you have it than that it be left for these Mexican dogs. Be careful not to overload yourselves. Remember that he travels safest who travels lightest. A portable bridge had been built with which the causeway was to be passed, and all seemed in readiness. Mass was said by Father Olmedo, asking divine protection through the perilous march before them. Then the gates were thrown open, and the Spaniards marched forth from the palace in which they had suffered so greatly and had shown such unyielding fortitude. It was a dark, rainy night. The great square before the palace was deserted, as indeed it had been since Montezuma's death. All was hushed in silence. Noiselessly but quickly, the army moved along the great street. The great city slept undisturbed. Already the causeway had been reached. Only a little longer, and they would be in safety on the opposite shore. But as the Spaniards drew near, the Indian sentinels caught the alarm and fled to rouse their countrymen. The priests who had been watching from the temples sounded the alarm, and the great drum in the temple of the god of war rang out, rousing the citizens. The Spaniards knew full well no time was to be lost. Hurriedly the bridge was stretched across the causeway, and the soldiers hurried over. Already the well-known yell of the Mexicans in battle array rang through the air. Louder and louder, nearer and nearer it came. Now came the arrows and sharp stones. Thicker and faster, more and more furious, they rained down upon the fleeing army. Smarting under the cutting blows from the sharp missiles, the army pressed on. At last all were over, and Magarino and his brave, strong aides were ready to raise the bridge to convey it to the next waterway. The Spaniards, though standing still in the midst of the cruel shower of stones, felt that only a little more and they would be beyond the reach of their Mexic foe. Only the bridge to be raised. Already Father Olmedo raised his voice in thanksgiving that Almighty God had protected his chosen people against the heathen army. Magarino was hard at work. "The bridge will not yield! The bridge will not yield!" whispered the horror-stricken men as they pulled and tugged with all their force. From man to man sprang the terrible tidings. "The bridge will not yield! The bridge will not yield!" Panic fell upon the army. Shut off from escape, unable to return, no hope was left. Each man thought only of his own life. Plunging into the water, some swam or forded across. Others, driven back, fell bleeding beneath the enemy's sword. Infantry and cavalry crowded in deadly confusion on the bank. The Mexicans fell upon the Spaniards without mercy. Some were killed, some imprisoned, others dragged off for sacrifice. Well was it for those soldiers struggling in the water who had not weighted themselves with the Mexic gold. The causeway was a scene of awful slaughter. The air rang with the crying of the dying and the shrieks of the wounded. And now the baggage, the treasure, the artillery, the dead had filled the causeway to the very top. Over this horrible bridge, those in the rear rushed on to the next pass. Here the same awful scene followed, and on the surviving ones pressed to the third pass. Cortez and the straggling bands of soldiers had at last reached the shore. The Mexicans did not follow on, and Cortez, worn out, almost hopeless, threw himself upon the steps of a temple to review his wretched, dripping, straggling, broken army as it passed before him. As the great general regarded the pitiful line before him, it is said he bowed his head and wept. The Mexicans were indeed revenged for all they had suffered from the Spaniards now. All the booty had come again into their hands. Cortez's bravest men were slain, and the army had been driven before the foe, a mere broken, wretched wreck. This night has ever since been called in Mexican history Noche Triste, or the sad night. Still, Cortez was not to be discouraged. Rousing himself, he formed his army into lines, planned for them a halt, and went on at once to plan revenge. Fortunately for the exhausted Spaniards, the Mexicans did not follow up their victory. They employed the day after their victory in clearing the streets of their city, burning the dead, and rejoicing over the sacrificing of their captives. Lame, wounded, half-famished, the Spanish army moved slowly away to Tlaxcala. What their welcome here would be, they knew not. They dared not think. Cortez cheered them on with the hope, which he hardly dared himself to trust, that friends would meet them. Fancy then the despair that seized upon them when, as they journeyed through the mountain pass, their scouts came scurrying back with, "A hostile army is before us. They are already assembled upon the mountain top to intercept our march." A halt was ordered. "My men," said Cortez, "there is no choice before us. Fight we must, and fight we will. Already the Aztecs are moving down upon us. Charge, strike at the chiefs, and trust in God." The armies fell upon each other. Upon the Aztec chieftain, the cavalry charged through the densest of the enemy's ranks. Cortez himself struck the fatal blow, and a cavalier pursuing the wounded chief seized the standard and bore it back to Cortez. The Aztecs fell back. The Spaniards pushed forward, driving the natives before them in dire confusion. No more a sense of hunger, no more a sense of exhaustion. "Revenge, revenge," was the battle cry. And revenge, full and terrible, the Spaniards heaped upon the flying Aztecs. Cortez and his men reached Tlaxcala, and cruel as they were, you will be relieved to know that welcome, warm, and hearty awaited them. Here, for 3 weeks, the army rested. At the end of that time, the undaunted Cortez began to plan a fresh campaign against the Aztecs. No sooner had he laid his plans before his officers than rebellion sprang up among his soldiers. Those from Cuba were longing to return to their sunny plantations and live in peace once more. Tired indeed of war were the soldiers. A petition was drawn up, requesting that Cortez abandon his ambitious schemes and allow them to leave the country in peace. Cortez, however, had no such idea. His veterans stood bravely for him, and although the number of his soldiers was at best but small, he believed that by wise playing of tribes against tribes, he could again attack the capital. Already Montezuma's successor had sent ambassadors to the Tlaxcalans, urging them to join in a common cause against the white men, but nothing less than flat refusal had been the answer returned. "You do not come to us as friends," said they, "neither would you be true to us when the white man had gone. You come to us in fear. You would use us to save your capital, then you would cast us off and turn again against us. We will fight side by side with the Spaniard, you the common foe." Accordingly, Cortez set forth accompanied by his allies. Success attended his every move, and again Cortez was rising to his old place in the esteem of the natives as a wonderful conqueror. Just here, Montezuma's successor, who had so bravely and wisely defied the Spaniards' approach, and who, had the neighboring tribes proved loyal to their common cause, would certainly have taken prisoner these Spaniards to a man, just here this warrior died. Okay, that's the end of that chapter.
So Cortez just died?
No, not Cortez. Montezuma's successor,
Who's that?
the one who replaced Montezuma.